Hey, morning, everybody. This is Miss Wynn. I just wanted to make sure that you guys are having a good time still at home, getting outside, and hopefully we can learn some new things today. So this is going to be an introduction to our ecology unit. You may have learned a little bit about ecology probably in elementary school, but most importantly, probably in your last assignment, which was the textbook reading and the know and wonder chart. Hopefully, you guys were able to just browse through what it was that those sections were saying. If you didn't get a chance yet, maybe you can listen to this assignment and go back and you'll have a deeper understanding of what some of those words or what those pages and diagrams were saying. So, our last unit for the year, is ecology, which is the study of how organisms in a population or an ecosystem are related and how those relationships go on to affect like other organisms, plants, and all the different species that happen to live in an ecosystem. So let's start with some of our driving questions. So hopefully by the end of our unit, we will be able to talk about and answer the questions, how are all living organisms related? And when thinking about it in a specific ecosystem, does every organism play a role? And lastly, how can we use what we know about organisms in an ecosystem to make predictions for Earth's future, right? Tying into our knowledge and study of climate change. So let's talk about what is an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community of organisms and the physical space that surround that community. So right here I have a picture of a coral reef, right? All the organisms that are in there are our tropical fish, our sea anemones, our coral, probably some bacteria and microbes that live in the ocean. We've got plankton, maybe other plant species. Um, other organisms that might exist on a coral reef are like reef sharks or sea turtles. So this is an ecosystem, but let's be specific. Ecosystems are micro level, right? So this particular coral reef that exists in Belize it can be like 1 square kilometer or maybe a couple of miles long. But what we're not talking about is the entirety of the Great Barrier Reef, which spans like hundreds of thousands of acres and miles and crosses like international borders. Like we want to think about really small areas for right now. So another good example might be like a pond within a national forest or like a waterfall in a jungle. And so like those small areas will bring enough organisms to to have us accurately study how they are related to one another. What we don't want to do is go too big. Like we can study the Amazon rainforest. Like there are way too many ecosystems within the Amazon rainforest, right? There's like the treetops, there's the forest floor, there's the Amazon River, which is a totally separate ecosystem than maybe some of the trees. Like you don't find piranhas in the forest floor. So when we think about an ecosystem, we want to think small, right? A pond, a single coral reef, and or a single waterfall. Yeah, so the tundra, the savanna, the Amazon rainforest, those are too big, and some of them are technically biomes, which means like we can organize certain ecosystems by the characteristics that they share, right? So like in every savanna, we would find like tall grass and probably some sort of like horse-like grazers. So is that gazelle, reebok, deer? Yeah, there's tons of savannas, not just the one that we think about. We think like the Lion King. So now that we know that an ecosystem is a small community of organisms and the smaller physical space that surrounds them, we can talk about what makes up an ecosystem. And we know that there are two factors that make up an entire ecosystem. There are these living factors, the biotic factors, trees, animals, bacteria, fungi, insects, anything that is living that exists in that real small location, those are our biotic factors. But we know that from natural selection, the living organisms can be deeply affected by the non-living elements in their ecosystem. So our abiotic factors. Remember, I think abiotic means not biotic. It's the opposite of. So abiotic factors in an ecosystem could be things like sunlight, geographical features, so mountains, oceans, if there's large rocks, the weather that occurs, so natural disasters. Like if we think about tornadoes, right? A tornado isn't living, but it definitely has an effect on the living organisms that are there. A tornado could pick up a living organism, swirl it around for a long time, and drop it back off like 100 miles from where it's from. And that would certainly affect that living organism, but then also the living organisms that are now, they're now sharing the same ecosystem. So non-living factors and living factors work together in harmony to create an ecosystem. Here's a little graphic here. Temperature is an abiotic factor that affects the living organisms. How much sunlight, right? If there's no sunlight, are plants able to grow? If there's no plants that are able to grow, what type of producers are there? So when thinking about ecosystems, ecologists, people who study ecology, think about two main things: energy flow and population dynamics. So when we study ecology, those are two big, broad topics that definitely relate to one another that we want to have a foundational knowledge of in order to explore. So in order to understand how populations in an ecosystem can change dynamics, scientists understand how energy flows through an ecosystem. So the two are related. We cannot talk about how a predator is related to its prey unless we understand how ecosystems organize themselves based on energy. And this diagram here is a diagram that shows the trophic levels. So trophic levels are levels of energy in an ecosystem characterized by the number of participants and the total energy that exists overall at that level. I'll explain more on the next slide. Right, so the classification of organisms will tie into the energy pyramid in the following way. So before we talk about who has energy and where the energy exists, let's talk about where the energy comes from. A couple of slides ago, I talked about producers. Sometimes we refer to producers as autotrophs, and I'll explain the meaning in a moment. So producers are organisms that get energy from non-living resources. Are we producers? Are humans producers? Do we make our own energy? No, we do not. We have to eat in order to survive. But what types of organisms don't? Plants, right? Plants get their energy from the sun. So about like 90% of all the producers on planet Earth get energy from the sun. They perform photosynthesis. They make their own energy. That's why they're called an autotroph. But there are really interesting examples, like deep in the ocean, or like deep in a cave. There are these people, or organisms. They're not people. Organisms that get energy from different like chemicals, like sulfuric vents. So like hot sulfuric acid vents that exist deep in the ocean. They are called chemotrophs because they can make their own food from the chemicals that are coming from these deep ocean vents. Isn't that cool? So, right, we can interchange producers and autotrophs because those are the types of organisms that are taking sunlight and making their own food. Next up, another type of organism we have is called a consumer or a heterotroph. A consumer is an organism that has to eat another organism to survive. We can further organize our consumers into different levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So primary consumers are the ones that eat our producers. So think about what types of organisms eat plants. The first thing that comes to mind, oh, I made this like really cute dinosaur fun, is like our Brontosaurus, right? Brontosaurus is a dinosaur that ate only plants. But like in today's world, we don't have dinosaurs anymore. We have things like bunny rabbits, mice, your hamster, right? Your hamster eats a lot of plants. So oftentimes our primary consumers are herbivores. So our primary consumers are those that sit above the producers in the energy pyramid, and they're going to eat mostly plant material. Then we have our secondary, oops, there's a little typo here, I'll change that. We have our secondary consumers, and those are consumers that eat the primary consumers. These are primarily carnivores. Sometimes they're omnivores, but like they could maybe eat the primary consumers and the producers. But for the most part, our secondary consumers, these are things like, look at this, this fish eats our plankton or our krill or shrimp. So things like, this is like a tuna maybe, or this is like a salmon, a carnivorous salmon. And then we keep going up the line. So now we have our tertiary consumers. Like, look at this, is like a Florida marlin is eating fish that eat shrimp or plankton. And those shrimp or plankton were eating our microbes, so other types of plankton. There's two types of plankton. There's plankton, photosynthetic plankton, green plankton, or there's also zooplankton, which actually is plankton that eats other plankton. Did you know that? Then we have our last group of consumers called the quaternary consumers. Sorry, I can't remember what I said. But these are quaternary consumers. Quarter, meaning like fours or fourth level. Quaternary consumers, we have our sharks. Sometimes we have our grizzly bears. We have our lions. These are our apex predators, top of the pyramid. They come to a point because they are eating from all the levels below it. Now, a shark is probably not going to eat our blue-green algae, like our green plankton, but they are definitely eating probably a couple of rows underneath them. It is a misconception that sharks will only eat prey that is like big enough to satiate it. I have a feeling like if a small fish swims into the mouth of a shark, it's not going to spit it out. Okay. Consumers are also called heterotrophs. We have dealt with this prefix hetero all year. Hetero, what does it mean? Different. Consumers are called heterotrophs because they eat food that is different from them. So in this slide here, you'll see how we go from primary producers to quaternary consumers, as well as how we can categorize the different types of consumers. Are they carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, someone who eats both plants and animals, and then scavengers. Okay, so here's another example of how energy can flow through an ecosystem. We have energy from the sun coming down into the what of a plant? The chloroplasts and the chlorophyll, performing the process of photosynthesis so the plant can have its own food. Then we have our grasshopper. Grasshopper over here is eating the plant. Then we've got a frog eating the grasshopper, and then a bird eating the frog. And so we see the arrows of this diagram are showing how energy is transferred from one place to another. It's not about who eats who, right? Then our arrows would be pointing the other way. It's about the sun is giving energy to the plant. The plant is giving energy to the grasshopper. The grasshopper is giving energy to the frog. So in these diagrams, you'll see that the arrows flow the way that the energy is moving. So here we are thinking about energy pyramids. So the best way to show how energy flows in an ecosystem is to create a pyramid and categorize the organisms in that ecosystem by where they fall in energy level, right? So we've got our producers at the bottom. That is a trophic level number 1. We've got grasshoppers above that because we know grasshoppers eat plants. Frogs above that. Oh my goodness. Frogs above that because we know that frogs eat grasshoppers. Snake above frog and hawk above snake. These trophic levels represent the types of organisms or the types of consumer producer that exist in an ecosystem. One thing that we want to know about is that we can represent the total amount of energy available at that level based on the number of organisms and how much energy they are giving to the next level, right? So we've got grass. What we see here is 10,000 kilocalories of energy available for everybody above it to eat. But a hawk doesn't necessarily eat grass, but a grasshopper does. But why is a hawk only worth 1 kilocalorie? I'll explain. So in general, 10% of the energy available from one to the next is moving up. So that means 90% of grass isn't getting eaten and moving up our energy pyramid. Grass is existing, it's photosynthesizing, it's providing a nice cover, it's providing shade for people, maybe it's producing some seeds or I don't know, like cotton, right? We use cotton in order to make shirts, but not all grasshoppers are eating all the grass. So that means the grasshoppers that are eating the grass are only getting 10% of that energy. Probably because there is not one grasshopper for every one blade of grass, right? There are less grasshoppers per blades of grass. And then we keep thinking about that, right? There are not as many frogs as there are grasshoppers. And there certainly are not that many snakes compared to frogs. And then eventually we get to our hawk. Now, hawks can fly. So their space in which they can get energy, in which they can go collect food, is very, very large. So for every like 4 miles of grass, there's probably one hawk. You know how much grass, how many individual blades of grass there would be for 4 miles? Probably maybe even 20 miles for a hawk. I'm not sure the exact radius a hawk is going in and out of every day. But I know that in general, we can see the difference between there's one hawk that we can see and probably like a quadrillion blades of grass, right? So we're thinking about the available energy and the number of organisms that occupy each level. Right here, we've got different names for our levels. So this will go interchangeably. Level 1, we're going to call our producers. Level 2, our primary consumers. Level 3, our secondary consumers. And this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Our third level is the secondary, but that's because they're secondary consumers, meaning they're above both the producers and the primary consumers, all the way to our tertiary consumers. And then here's our weird word again, quaternary, top, apex predators. I think I've mentioned this before, but in general, the organisms that are at the top of our energy pyramid represent the least amount of energy available in that ecosystem. Meaning, not that if we were to eat a hawk, there's only like 1 kilocalorie of energy available to us, but rather that there, for all of this energy, only 1 calorie made it all the way up to the hawk. Does that make sense? So we had so much energy in our grass level and it moved through all of our other consumers. By the time it made it to the hawk, only 1 calorie of this energy made it all the way up. Does that make sense? So what we see here is a different representation of a pyramid, but we can talk about, okay, here's our energy available at each level. See, like 70% of this like block is red, maybe like 60%. But this is all the energy that is available to go up, and this is the energy that just exists. It's lost. Eventually it will die. It is not moving through our energy pyramid. So, and then we go to our second level, only this level of energy is moving up. And then only this level of energy is moving up. So by the time a hawk is able to eat the same energy that existed in plant form, it is a very small amount. In general, only 10% of the energy available in each level is passed on to the next. And lastly, I want to reiterate, think about quantity. The reason that there is a smaller number of energy is also based on the number of participants at that level, right? We certainly have a lot more cows than we do hawks, or like we have a lot more bunnies than there are rattlesnakes, thinking about maybe like a desert ecosystem. So what I want you to do is, if you need to, pause this recording after I give you the prompt. I want you to think about a specific ecosystem and take a couple of minutes to draw a basic food chain showing how energy moves from producer to the top consumers. So you can think of any ecosystem you want to, but I want to give you some examples, right? Let's think like small Like, let's think of a abiotic feature containing water, and think about what animals would exist around that feature. So, like, if we're thinking about the stereotypical watering hole in the African savanna, we've got lions, we've got gazelle, and we have tall grass. If you are thinking of this ecosystem, can you show me with arrows how energy moves from our producers to our top consumers? Same thing with the Yosemite Valley. There's a creek and some ponds that exist in the valley floor. Some of the organisms that live in the Yosemite Valley are black bears, mule deer, chipmunks, and they've got elm trees. The elm trees produce acorns. Wonder who's going to eat those. Another example would be the Mojave Desert. I'm thinking about like up north by Lancaster, or maybe even out towards Joshua Tree. We've got rattlesnakes. We've got a desert hare. That's also called a rabbit. And then a prickly pear cactus. How does energy flow from producer to top consumer in this? So go ahead, pause. Take a couple of moments to show me a food chain, a basic food chain of how energy goes from producer to consumer. Okay. Assuming that you paused and you were able to draw out what you thought the best food chain would be, let's compare. Does your food chain exist as a linear map? Meaning energy goes from one thing to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. One thing to the next, to the next, to the next. If it does, that's perfect, because this is an example of a food chain. This is an example of a food chain, right? Chain together, meaning there's one point of contact. But is this the best representation for how all of our organisms in the ecosystem are related? Right, I'm going to say it again. Is this simplistic linear food chain the best representation for how animals in an ecosystem exist amongst each other? Right? If we're thinking about our ecosystem, humans' ecosystem, do I only eat one thing? Do I only eat cheeseburgers? No. Do we only eat chicken? No, we eat so many. Or do we only eat tofu for our vegetarians out there? We have the ability to eat almost everything below us, right? So we know that ecosystems have a complex multi-dimensional feeding relationship. So our apex predators are probably eating, they're probably not going down to level 1, but our hawk could certainly eat a grasshopper. It's not allergic to it. And a hawk could certainly eat a frog. It probably is preferring to eat a snake because that may be a bigger meal for them. They will have to hunt less. But in general, if there's a frog sitting undefended and the hawk is right there, it's not going to say no, right? And think about us. If humans are at the top, obviously we can eat a cow, cattle, right? Beef, pork. We could eat a chicken. Probably I'd put that at our level 3. We can eat, or probably maybe chicken's like at number 2 at the grasshopper. And we also eat plants. We eat spinach. We eat broccoli, right? We eat kale salads. So what I want you to think about is that it's not linear. It doesn't go from top to bottom. What it might look like is an interconnected web of relationships. So you drew a food chain and I asked you to, but I asked you to do that so we could see, there seems to be a lot more relationships in an ecosystem than just a single point of contact, right? So this is an ocean ecosystem. We've got our phytoplankton making energy from the sun, and then that's giving energy to our copepods. These are our zooplankton or our krill. These are tiny, tiny little shrimp. And from this, right, we actually can feed a couple of different types of organisms. The birds, like a pelican or a seagull, certain types of fish, certain seals will eventually eat some krill. And then we have our baleen whales. So baleen whales, even though they are so big, They only eat microscopic organisms that can fit through their baleen. Um, you should look that up on YouTube. I wish I could give you an example of it, but I forgot to include it in this. Look up baleen whales. They're very cool. They have teeth that are like filters, and they only eat, darn it, and they only eat um, microscopic organisms. Okay, so in general, with this slide, what I wanted you to realize was that these interconnected webs are a more accurate representation of how organisms interact, right? There are many predator and prey relationships that exist in this ecosystem, and it's all a careful balance, right? If the leopard seal ate everything below it, would there be enough energy for our sperm whale or our toothed whales, like our classic orca whale or killer whale, right? So it's a balance of, of feeding relationships that keeps ecosystems safe and healthy. Here are other examples of food webs, right? Our rabbit is eating grass, and but the kangaroo rat is also eating maybe the same grass, but a rattlesnake could eat both a kangaroo rat and a tarantula and a rabbit. So there are many feeding relationships here. Same thing with our like forest ecosystem. Look at a Douglas squirrel. Look at all these nice names. Okay. So knowing what we know about energy dynamics, what we can now do is predict our population dynamics. How can we think about how an ecosystem's participants, like our organisms in our ecosystem, how can we predict that they will change over time? We can think about population dynamics because we now know about how energy flows, the feeding relationships, and what other factors can determine how many organisms are at each level. So changes in populations are determined in 4 ways. They're very self-explanatory, right? If you think about a population of, I'll use the cats in my driveway. So I live in Hawthorne. There are a lot of cats that love to hang out around my driveway, in my alley, by my recycling bins, in my backyard. Obviously, the number of cats is going to change if more are born, especially because cats can give off like 10 kittens at a time. Obviously, that number is also going to change if any kittens are met with an untimely death. There are coyotes sometimes in my neighborhood. There are cars, right? Maybe it'll get sick. There are a lot of like fleas and ticks. So if those cats aren't being treated for those, they might die. So we've got births and deaths. And then we've also got immigration and emigration. So let's say a house cat runs away from its house and it comes to find all the cool alley cats that live in my driveway. They might adopt that house cat as its new population. Or emigration, like if I were to take one of the kittens that was born and give it to my neighbor, oh, you want a kitten? Here it is. So thinking about the cats in my driveway as the microcosm for what is happening here, we can think about how populations change, births, deaths, people coming into the population, and people leaving the population. We can also think about immigration and emigration as if organisms are separated by geographic boundaries. So if we've got like a river or a pond, and like let's say a chipmunk falls off a tree and lands on a piece of driftwood, and now it's going down the river and it's finally getting out, and now it's among a new organization or a new population of organisms, that's going to be an example of immigration. The new population is going to get a new member, and the old population is going to lose a member. But in general, population growth is tied to available resources. So remember back, I think some of you were able to do the rabbits and natural selection simulation, and in some of those cases, the bunnies would all die, and that's based on if they have enough resources. So if a population of rabbits migrates to a new habitat, one with unlimited water and food and no predators, how do we think that population will grow? population growth is tied to available resources. So if there was unlimited resources, everybody could have as much water and as much food as they wanted, and there was no predators. There are no wolves, no coyotes, no hawks, nothing to eat them. Do we predict their population will go up in numbers, down in numbers? Will they stay the same? Think about it on a piece of paper, or you can think about it in your mind. Did your population graph look like this? Like if there was two rabbits to start with, and there was no limits on water and food, no predators to hide from. They just keep going up and up. 2 bunnies becomes 4 bunnies, becomes 16 bunnies, becomes 1,000 bunnies. Oh my gosh, this is called exponential growth. And you might remember exponential growth from Mr. Warholt's class. It is a mathematical phenomenon that talks about how numbers can change in a predictable pattern. And in this instance, it's doubling every generation, right? Exponential growth means doubling every marker or every generation. But because that scenario, the one where the resources were unlimited, that is unrealistic. Organisms do not live in habitats with unlimited resources, even humans, right? We need food to feed everybody on planet Earth. We need a space to put everybody on planet Earth, and no predators. So organisms don't live in that unrealistic utopia. What they do have are limited resources. There is not enough food and water for everybody. And there are definitely predators to most organisms on planet Earth. So most populations are maxed out by this line called the carrying capacity. So if we're thinking about our population growth over time, we got a couple rabbits, they're having a good time, there's enough food, and all of a sudden, maybe there's not enough food, there's not enough grass, they ate it all, there was a drought, it doesn't grow. Eventually, our population will start to level off because of this limiting factor called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is literally a line on a graph, a number that says that no more individuals can exist safely in this society. So if a population passes that carrying capacity, those organisms are probably not going to survive for very long. And we'll learn about that phenomenon in an activity next week. So we've got our carrying capacity. That is the limit on a population that says, hey, this is the safest number of organisms we can support in this environment. Okay. Whew. That was a lot. I feel like I talked very quickly. What I want you to do is go to the checking for understanding for this. So if you click on this link, you'll go to a blank copy, but I want to say that if you are looking at this on Google Classroom, a copy of this has already been made, but I want to show you how it works. So a copy for this has already been made for you. It should be in your drive. You can complete it whenever, but you're going to look at this image. You're going to answer the questions on this slide, and then on your copy, it's going to look like turn in when done. You've seen this type of guided practice before, so what you need to look at, you can make these images bigger, you can zoom in. You're going to want to look at what it says and just answer the questions. Don't think too deeply about them. Just whatever is on the page, try and fit it into your answer here. All right, that is our introduction to ecology. This is our lecture. Hopefully now, if you have not done the reading, you can go back and try and understand elements of the reading. And I'll see you guys at noon today for a little Zoom. Okay, have a great day, everybody. See you later. Bye.